After learning that there was another woman alive on Earth, Phil's attention immediately shifted to that beautiful woman. When Carol was being saved by her because Phil's car was about to explode, he instead immediately entered the woman's car. Finally, the three of them started driving to Phil's residence. As the car was moving, Phil kept staring at the woman's face. Meanwhile, his wife, Carol, was in the back seat trying to explain to the woman they just met that they were a married couple. Upon hearing Carol explain her status, Phil quickly rolled down Carol's car window, constantly talking about his status. And this is where Phil's fuckboy spirit emerged when they arrived at Phil's residence. He immediately showed off some luxurious items to the woman who introduced herself as Melissa. However, Phil's efforts failed when Carol said that Phil stole all those items. Then Carol and Phil told Melissa to find her own house nearby. And in the evening, she was invited to have dinner together. When Carol invited her to dinner, Melissa was deeply moved and couldn't believe that she would finally find another human. Then they hugged each other. Without any shame, Phil also hugged Melissa. That evening, Carol also invited Melissa to cook together. Carol asked Melissa to taste her own cooking. When Melissa tasted Carol's cooking, her facial expression indicated that Carol's dish wasn't good, but she wanted to appreciate Carol by saying that Carol's dish was very delicious. Then Carol asked Phil to come down because the food was ready and they would soon have dinner. When Phil came down from his room, they were both really surprised, because Phil suddenly shaved his hair and beard, making him look very different. During dinner, Phil started flirting with Melissa without seeing Carol as his wife, where he asked about Melissa's past life. Melissa said she had been married to a jerk named Greg who ended up cheating with the police. Hearing that Melissa was single made Phil even more tempted and tried continuously to approach her. But because Melissa knew that Phil was married to Carol, she chose to talk about Carol and Phil's marriage. Here Phil's feelings began to change towards Carol, because when dinner was over and Melissa went home, Carol invited Phil to resume their relationship so that they could quickly have children. But Phil refused the invitation with the excuse that he was experiencing diarrhea. Finally, Phil decided to sleep alone. When he was asleep, he suddenly woke up by the sound of Melissa inviting him downstairs. But once again, it was a trick. Because when Phil went to her, it was actually Carol who made Phil scream hysterically. The next day, Melissa returned to Carol and Phil's residence, where Phil continues to seek Melissa's attention, where he suddenly became a bodybuilder by lifting a barbell to shape his chest muscles. After finishing his exercise, he then asked Melissa about the purpose and intention of her visit. Melissa replied that she was just surprised by a Volkswagen car that suddenly appeared at her house. Seeing the car, Phil pretended that he wasn't the one who gave her the car, suspecting that it was a gift from a fairy. Then suddenly Carol came and yelled at Phil. Carol started getting jealous of Phil's excessive behavior towards Melissa, where she bought Melissa a car, while the broken door of her house was never fixed. Finally, because he didn't want Carol to get angry, Phil promised to fix it. Then Carol and Melissa began to tell stories, where Carol showed the wedding book between her and Phil, which Carol painted herself. Carol also told about her good intentions with Phil to regenerate the human population, but she didn't want to do that without getting married, so she finally married Phil. Hearing Carol's story made Melissa emotional because she saw Phil and Carol very happy. In the afternoon, when Phil was fixing Carol's house door, Melissa suddenly came to invite him and Carol to drink a cold beer that she had prepared at her house. Phil gladly accepted the offer and promised to bring Carol along. But in reality, Phil didn't take Carol with him, citing that Carol was experiencing diarrhea and couldn't come with him. Finally, Phil took advantage of the situation to continue flirting with Melissa. And Phil's opportunity grew when Melissa began to talk about missing the touch of a man. Phil said he was ready to serve Melissa if she ever needed a man's touch, but Melissa refused because Phil was married to Carol. Finally, Phil went to Carol to discuss their separation, but it changed when Phil saw Carol making a bouquet of flowers that she dedicated to Phil. Seeing Carol's effort made Phil change his mind, and he didn't go through with divorcing Carol. He only said he had diarrhea. At night, the three of them decided to have a camping session, where Carol showed her affection for Phil in front of Melissa. Seeing Carol's behavior made Phil feel like his chances of flirting with Melissa were diminishing. When Carol was getting drinks, Phil brought up Melissa's longing for a man's touch. But Melissa said that her words weren't truly sincere because she was drunk at the time. But Phil kept pressing Melissa, and Melissa emphasized that she didn't want to ruin her friendship with Carol. Finally, Carol came back and poured drinks. After they had one glass, Carol suddenly said that she was excited, and immediately grabbed Phil's hand. You know the rest. The next day, Phil returned to Melissa's house to continue trying to flirt with her. Phil dressed very neatly to catch Melissa's attention. But Phil's efforts truly failed, because Melissa didn't want to be involved with a married man. Finally, Phil returned home and cried to Carol. Carol, seeing her husband distressed, tried to calm him down and asked what had happened. Phil said he had to be involved with Melissa instead if he didn't want his children to be involved with each other. He did this while trying to get Carol's attention to allow him. Hearing Phil ask for permission like that, Carol immediately got angry and told Phil to leave, calling him a stinky skunk. After that incident, Phil was suddenly approached by Melissa asking about what Phil had said to Carol, which caused Carol to come to her and say that Melissa had stolen her husband. Hearing that, Phil said he knew nothing about it. Melissa explained that she had tried to find other humans to get along with, but this time she had to accept the hatred of her female friends because of Phil's behavior. Feeling guilty, Phil invited Melissa to fix everything by inviting her to lunch. But that was clearly rejected by Melissa, who immediately left Phil. Phil thought hard to fix the situation. He finally had an idea to get forgiveness from the women around him. Then Phil held a makeshift night market that he built to attract Carol and Melissa's attention. Phil even wanted to embarrass himself so that Carol would forgive him. Using a loudspeaker, Phil continuously tried to flirt with Carol and Melissa, who were reading books together at Carol's residence. Feeling disturbed, they both finally decided to approach Phil. Seeing Melissa and Carol come, Phil immediately apologized to both of them. Phil's apology was accepted and Carol then invited Phil to talk for a while. In front of both of them, Phil tensely tried to listen to Carol's words. Then Carol explained that she had talked a lot with Melissa in the final decision. For the survival of humanity, Carol allowed Phil to be involved with Melissa, with the condition only 3 times in 1 month. Initially, Phil refused because for him, it wasn't enough, but he tried to accept it first. Then Carol explained again that Melissa was pregnant, so Phil was not allowed to touch her at all. Phil agreed very much with that, and he was very grateful to both of them. Then he said goodbye and went home. On the way, Phil was so happy that he finally got the opportunity he had always dreamed of. The next day, Carol came to Phil because it was the day when Phil had to be involved with Melissa. With enthusiasm and neatly dressed, Phil happily accepted the offer. Then he met Melissa and took her to a park, where Phil had prepared the atmosphere as best as possible so that Melissa felt safe and comfortable being near him. Seeing Phil's effort, Melissa was flattered and she wanted to do it quickly. But Phil held her back because he still had a surprise. Then he lit the guitar and started playing it, where at the same time fireworks appeared and went straight up to the sky. But it seemed that wasn't the right move for Phil. Because of the explosion of the fireworks, a sports car immediately approached the source of the explosion. And when Phil was really going to be involved with Melissa, the sports car arrived at the right time to disrupt the moment between the two of them. At first, Phil thought it was Carol's doing, but the owner of the sports car came out and turned out to be a man. Then he introduced himself as Todd. After the arrival of another man named Todd, Melissa immediately shifted her attention to Todd. Melissa appeared to be very caring for Todd as he told the story of his life after traveling around America alone. Todd recounted how he almost went to Mexico if he hadn't seen the fireworks that Phil lit, and he was very thankful for that. Finally, the party was held with the 4 of them, where Carol was with Phil, and Todd accompanied Melissa. At that night's session, Todd told the story of his life after Phil asked about Todd's weight. Todd happily replied that he weighed 258 kilograms. And that's what caused him to be bullied a lot during high school, where he was once made the king of alumni by his friends. It made Todd very proud of himself. But all that changed when he found out he was actually compared to a pig that was made into a queen. Hearing that story, everyone was very sad to hear about the bullying Todd had experienced. However, Melissa defended Todd by saying that now all of Todd's high school friends were dead. After Todd finished his story, Phil brought up Melissa again about the relationship he would have. But Melissa refused because she had found another man. And that made Phil, who initially seemed like a fuckboy, now turned into a sad boy. As the night grew later, Todd decided to rest and left them, followed by Melissa, who left to rest, making Phil even more tortured because he failed to have a relationship with her. The next day, Carol had the idea of throwing a party where she would unite Todd with Melissa. Soon after, Phil came suddenly and immediately saw the invitation card. When he saw the invitation card, Phil's face suddenly changed, but he couldn't refuse it, and finally the invitation was spread to Todd and Melissa. But Phil's efforts didn't stop there. because immediately he went to Melissa's residence and again discussed one of Melissa's favorite movies. That is Shawshank Redemption, where he could even quote a few lines from one of the actors there until complete, which made Melissa quite impressed with that. But all of Phil's efforts were shattered when it turned out Phil had prepared it on a piece of paper that he kept on Melissa's door. And it turned out Melissa knew about it, and she was very sure if Phil had never watched the movie. Then Melissa slammed the door, indicating that she was no longer interested in Phil. Then the scene shifts when Todd and Melissa arrive after receiving a vacation invitation card from Carol. After the two of them arrived and gathered, Carol started her idea, where she pretended to be nauseous and vomiting, which turned out to be Carol's drama. After she finished with her affairs, Carol suddenly told Todd and Melissa to go on vacation without her, because she would be fine with Phil taking care of her. Not long after, Phil arrived, who initially disagreed with letting Todd and Melissa go on vacation together. Finally, reluctantly had to allow Todd and Melissa to vacation together for the sake of Carol's idea. Then Todd and Melissa went to a golf course, where they played a game of golf and interacted very well. In the distance, Phil apparently monitored their movements, and he showed a very jealous expression when Melissa and Todd held hands. The next day, they entertained themselves again by playing tennis, where before they played tennis, Phil had the idea of opening his shirt for men, to distinguish between the men's and women's teams. Melissa said the net was enough for them to distinguish between the women's and men's teams. But Todd didn't mind, and he opened his shirt. When Todd opened his shirt, Melissa immediately noticed the stitches on Todd's body. Finally, Todd told if he donated his kidney to an orphanage. Hearing Todd tell his story again made Phil disgusted. He decided to play tennis alone when Melissa and Carol were listening to Todd's story. When Phil was picking up his ball in a place, he suddenly saw Melissa and Todd being affectionate, which made Phil even more jealous. Not long after, Carol came and said Todd was the right partner for Melissa. That night, Phil came to Melissa to ask for an explanation about Todd. Instead of asking for an explanation, Phil insulted Todd by saying he had some friends with big body posture, and they deserved to be teased for the rest of their lives. Hearing Phil insult Todd made Melissa very angry. She slammed the door hard and kicked Phil out. Phil, who regretted it, finally apologized to Melissa and said that Todd was a very good man. Then he told if he had been traveling for 2 years just to find a woman like Melissa. After hearing Phil's story, Melissa finally opened the door, and finally Phil took Melissa to where he kept his imaginary friends in the form of balls. There he introduced Kevin, Gray, etc. to Melissa. Then he explained if he had never watched Shawshank Redemption, because his favorite movie is The Godfather. He also explained his feelings for Melissa, where when he first saw her, Phil immediately fell in love and felt like he wanted to keep staring into Melissa's eyes. And Phil hopes Melissa feels the same way about him. But Melissa's answer is no. After hearing Melissa's answer, Phil suddenly changed the topic and said if he would say that to Carol. This is the end of The Last Man on Earth Part 2. Like, comment, and subscribe so I will soon make a recap of Part 3 for The Last Man on Earth. Thank you for watching.